All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to everyone to our webinar today. We are especially welcoming all the members of the Development Resource Group and those who are interested in that organization, which is part of CWR. We'll talk about that a little bit later. During our webinar today, we are going to be hearing and viewing the panelists, but we don't have a grid of faces as we would with a flash conversation where we talk about things that are happening in a slightly different way. In this format, we are recording the entire presentation. It'll be available later if you need to duck out early, or if for anyone who is not able to attend today. Your questions are very welcome. You can submit them through chat and the Q&A function. We'll be watching that and presenting those questions to our panelist, our presenter, our lone panelist. And there'll be an opportunity to follow up if a question doesn't get answered during the presentation. So I'd like to actually just start by introducing Melissa. I'm sorry, is it Spaz?
You've got it.
You'd think I would learn how to ask about pronouncing. I also forgot to introduce myself. I'm Jennifer Brandlin. I'm the Director of Communications for the Sisters of the Holy Names of Jesus and Mary, and I am really pleased that my community is part of the current cohort for the Lake Institute's group that Melissa will be talking about. Melissa has a great love for women religious and has worked with them for a long time. She'll be telling about her work with various organizations and presenting data that I think will be of use to all of us. So without any further delay, I'd like to turn it over to you, Melissa. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you to Ginny for the invitation. I'm really delighted to be with you, Communicators for Women Religious, for this webinar conversation, and particularly to have the opportunity to talk with you about what it is that we see in a new context. Some familiar challenges in development, but also recognizing the complexity and newness of the context in which we find ourselves. As Jennifer mentioned, I work at the Lake Institute on Faith and Giving, which is part of Indiana University's Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. And I always get to tell this terrible joke, which is that we are the greatest school of philanthropy in the world. We're the first, the only school of philanthropy. And based in Indianapolis, the Lake Institute, which is my group within the Lilly Family School, is focused entirely on the intersection between faith and giving. And we pursue our work through research, both social science research and more qualitative methods, scholarship about faith and philanthropy, money and meaning. We also have extensive educational program, including an executive certificate in religious fundraising and a program for parishes or congregations called Cultivating Generous Congregations. And then the third area of our work is in public understanding about topics related to faith and giving, where we seek to invite speakers and other practitioners to talk about the way in which money impacts their ability to pursue ministry. And through this work at Lake Institute, I have had the privilege of working with congregations of women religious across the years, including the congregation that Jennifer is a part of. She mentioned the Advancing Mission Initiative, which is supported by the GHR Foundation and the Conrad and Hilton Foundation. And through that work across the last, now it's been 7 or 8 years, Lake Institute has resourced 2 cohorts of congregations across the landscape of women religious to think about development in the context of the changes that they have experienced And we're currently finishing up our second cohort's interaction with this initiative, which has a grant making function and an educational component. It's a delight and a privilege to learn with and from sisters and nuns about the hospitality that is involved in extending welcome to those entrusted to our care as donors. And around the School of Philanthropy, something that is regularly repeated is the idea that fundraising itself is the gentle art of teaching the joy of giving. And I have to say, if that is the case, then it's my experience that women religious are some of the very best teachers of fundraising, because the joy of giving moves in both directions. And I have learned a tremendous amount about hospitality, about generosity on every dimension, and about the power of inviting others to share in mission, to join in the advancement of charism and the expression of the faith in the world. And when we do that with intention, development can be a life-giving activity, as opposed to the experience that I'm afraid many of us have inherited of feeling like raising budget or fundraising is something that we would prefer not to have to do, but it's something that we'll hold our nose and enter into anyway. But seeing the joy, seeing the enthusiasm, seeing the passion of leaders when it comes to development work is just a tremendous privilege for me. The topic that I want to share from today is really more connected to some of the challenges that we have all experienced and observed across the past 15 years, due to the novel coronavirus COVID-19 pandemic and the way in which that pandemic intersects with existing trend and challenge. Yes, for congregations of women religious, but also for the constituencies that you care for in sort of broad expanse of your mission and ministry. I think that it's important to recognize that we are still in the midst of some of this upheaval or disruption. I've taken to saying that we're now in late pandemic because, and I know this is particularly salient for those of you who work in international community or have a global connection within your own religious institute or congregation, that this is not something that has resolved. Even as we see life opening up again in the United States, we're cognizant that the impact of the coronavirus disease and related economic fallout, the intersection with racial injustice and its persistence, these are things that we will all be negotiating institutionally and as leaders for a long time to come. But that being said, the location that I occupy at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy and in the Lake Institute gives me the privilege of really intentionally thinking with social scientists about what we can observe about impact as it relates to mission advancement, fundraising, development, the generosity that we know exists and is often catalyzed by crisis, and the practices of nonprofit organizations of all kinds. So I'm going to share a little bit of research, a little bit of data, but I want to acknowledge that when Ginny and I began this conversation, part of the catalyst for that was an article that I had published in April on our website about familiar challenges in a new context. and really intentionally sharing from the Charities Aid Foundation of America report on the impact of the pandemic on nonprofit organizations overall. And I was sharing from that because I found it to be helpful, particularly for organizations who have a mission that extends beyond what we think of as sort of traditional religiosity, meaning not parishes, not church institutions directly, but human serving organizations with a faith affiliation, for example, or educational institutions. And that Charities Aid Foundation of America report indicated that 72.54% of all nonprofit organizations had reported reduced contributions at some point during the pandemic, and an increased need for frontline nonprofit services or a need to develop new and responsive programs, with 40.74% reporting some increased costs. And my colleague, Dan Cardinale, who is the Executive Director of Independent Sector, which is a membership organization for not-for-profit groups of all sorts, was just very clear in helping me to understand the way in which that intersecting challenge of increased demand and simultaneously challenged resource or revenue really opens up some possibility for innovation and forward thinking, future thinking, particularly when we think about the kind of impact that nonprofit organizations can have in a local community. I'm deeply compelled by this, and I have to say that it's not necessarily a connection I would have made immediately, but I was grateful to Ginny for her inquiry, because I see through our work with Advancing Mission and Congregations of Women Religious, and through other work that we do with a wide range of faith-related nonprofit organizations, the deep desire to hold together the important purpose, the missional impact, the charism of a congregation, with responsiveness to need. And this has certainly been a season where there's lots of opportunity to observe the way in which we can show up, make ourselves available as organizations, as human serving nonprofits, as people of faith, and distinctively as sisters and nuns, as congregations of women religious, for that kind of impact in a critical moment. I come away from the time that I spend with congregations with women religious so deeply encouraged because of the clarity of vision about what kind of impact in crisis, what it can mean. And so I just wanted to offer that by way of preface, but then I'm going to jump in and I'm going to share my screen with you because I want to talk numbers. And I recognize that I am very enthusiastic about the social science research. I don't expect everyone to share my enthusiasm, but I think it helps us to be able to look at the landscape, to look at what is, so that we can then situate our own particular context, our own particular capabilities within that frame in order to make good decisions about where we might go next. So I'm going to share from several different research studies, including Lake Institute's National Study of Congregations' Economic Practices, which is really reflective of the religious subsector of the US nonprofit sector, fairly narrowly defined, because it is looking at parishes, at congregations and religious bodies. That is something that I would say is informative for women religious while being adjacent to it. And I'll say a little bit more of that as we go. But I want to be clear from the outset that this is still a season of tremendous change. And so data that we have received across 2020 and this first half of 2021 is reflective of that transition, that upheaval, that liminality. We probably, with good social science research, will not be able to say much about the long-term impact of 2020, of COVID-19, of these intersecting pandemics until sometime in the future when we arrive at a new baseline. But I have to say that spending time with other thinkers, it's clear to me that there is just something really exciting about the way that change can be catalyzed by crisis if we are willing to be open to the possibility. We have just received the new data from Giving USA 2021, which reflects, this says 2019, but it should say 2020, contributions. $471.44 billion. More dollars donated in 2020 to the nonprofit sector overall than ever before. I think that's important to make note of because we know that generous people, givers, are deeply motivated to address urgent need. And so seeing that there are more dollars operating in the nonprofit sector now than at any time in the past should be a real encouragement to us. Giving to religion in 2020 reflected 28% of all giving, nearly double the next largest subsector, which is education. But when I think about congregations of women religious, it's entirely possible that your significant fundraising efforts are measured primarily in other subsectors, in human services, or in health, or in public society benefit, because the nature of your congregational life or your associated ministries is really directed toward that kind of impact. We also know that over time, giving to religion, narrowly defined, that's primarily to religious congregations, has declined as a part of market share in the nonprofit sector. So this shows 5-year spans beginning in the early 1980s through 2020. And we see that even as late as the early 1990s, giving to religion reflected more than 50% of all charitable activity in the United States. Now, there are a couple of other trends that map with this, so I don't want it to be disturbing or unsettling, but I think it's important to have eyes wide open and to recognize that the way in which American givers direct their resources has shifted. Since that early 1990s benchmark, we know that there has been a significant decline in religious affiliation. And even in the 21st century, a dramatic increase in the proportion of US adults who self-identify as religious nuns, nothing in particular, not N-U-N-S, but N-O-N-E-S. And that subsector of religiously unaffiliated are very, very unlikely to give to religion as it is narrowly defined by Giving USA to congregations or religious bodies. They are, however, equally likely as self-identified people of faith to give to other subsectors in the nonprofit sector, including human services or education, public society benefit, etc. So that's one trend, the increase in religious disaffiliation. The second trend that I would map here with this decline in market share of giving to religion is the rise in the number of 501c3 nonprofit organizations that are independently incorporated. I suspect that that's something that's familiar to many of you, because across the last several decades, there may have been ministries, part of the charism of the congregation, part of the clear missional focus that were once fully embedded and incorporated in the life of the congregation itself, but that now are independently incorporated and separated as a 501c3, whether that's healthcare, education, something related to human services, or provision for basic human needs. We just see that there's been a proliferation in nonprofit organizations of all kinds, including religiously identified nonprofit organizations. I'm a layperson in the United Methodist Church, and I always make an example of the congregations, the parishes that I have been a part of. Church that I belonged to several years ago reflects this trend of the increased number of nonprofit organizations, because in the 1990s, their preschool and a homeless services ministry were embedded within the congregation's life. Funding ran through the congregation's budget, and employees were employees of the church. But since that time, both of those ministries, preschool and a homeless services ministry, have separately incorporated as 501c3s. They're still supported in kind and by shared mission by that local parish, but they have independent governance and independent fundraising. This is healthy for both the church and for those organizations. But it does mean that dollars that used to be directed to the congregation, to religion as narrowly defined by Giving USA, are now instead directed to those nonprofit organizations. And I think that that's a trend that have been well underway for some time, and that we can expect to see continue. The other thing that I would simply point to is that we have, over the last 5 to 10 years, seen a significant decrease in the proportion of US households that are making regular charitable contributions. There's an increasing part of the US population that is not giving regularly to anyone at any time. I think that this is also important to investigate alongside rising economic inequality, because what we see is that there are fewer people with secure middle and upper middle class incomes, and more people who are really at that cusp and struggling to paycheck to maintain middle class grip. We can think about that in terms of generational transition, et cetera, but these things are all interrelated and intersecting. Now, Giving USA 2021 is available. I will make sure that we can share that link with you. I also wanted to mention, and many thanks to Brian Lavelle, who will help us to do this, that I will share all of these slides with you. You'll receive them via email. I'm also going to send some links in that email so that you will have access to all of the things that I'm referring to. I know there's a lot of data here. Again, I really enjoy this, and I hope that it is a helpful level setting resource for you as well. Now, I want to speak briefly about this national study of congregations' economic practices, which is a new national baseline study that was undertaken by Lake Institute, completed in 2019, so prior to the pandemic. And I share it with you because I think there is, even in this time of change and new challenge, a real familiarity to some of the things that we are experiencing today. And this pre-pandemic data can help us to normalize some of that trend, even while we recognize the acceleration that comes from a major unanticipated, unprecedented crisis. I'll also share the link to this full study so that you can have a sense of it. But this is a representative sample of congregations in the United States. And I recognize this is a little bit confusing because these are parishes. These are individual religious congregations of all religious traditions. So not only Christian, but reflective of the full landscape of US people of faith. We had a very robust response rate of 40% representation from across the country, very, very small membership organizations or congregations to mega churches, and some very historic congregations and some that are newly established, representing 108 distinct denominational or religious groups. The analytical focus of the study was on how congregations receive, manage, and spend financial resources. It had been the mid-1980s, the last time there was a representative baseline study conducted, where the unit of analysis was not the individual donor, but instead the congregation as beneficiary recipient. And this is something that's significant because unlike registered 501c3 nonprofit organizations, congregations are exempt from filing with the IRS to have transparency about their finances. And so we knew much less about what was happening in congregations than what we're familiar with from other parts of the nonprofit sector. And so having a better sense of who gives to congregations when and how congregations relate to money and what they do as stewards of the gifts that they receive, and then thinking about how resources are spent. There's also another category that interests me a great deal, which is really the way in which religious communities regard the resources, the financial resources entrusted to them. How do they think about money as an asset, as a tool for accomplishing the things that they are called to? I want to share just briefly about the demographics within this sample, because I think it gives a sense of what this landscape looks like. And it is easy for us, I say this within my own tradition, as a white mainline Protestant, I observe it when I work with Roman Catholics as well, that we can easily assume that our experience is a normative experience and reflective of the broader picture. But there is a great deal of diversity in religious experience in the United States. And so within our sample, which was weighted for validity against some other representative research samples, we found that of the congregations in the study, over 1,200, the largest number significantly were evangelical Protestant congregations at 43% of the sample, followed by 28% mainline Protestant, 14% Black Protestant, and 10% Roman Catholic. 5% of the congregations in the sample were other religious traditions, non-Christian. Now, this is not reflective of the demographics of believers in the United States. This will be obvious to you because more than 20% of US individuals self-identify as Roman Catholic. But Roman Catholic parishes are large relative to the size of evangelical Protestant or mainline Protestant or Black Protestant churches. And so when we look at the congregation as the unit of analysis, we can see that this is a different kind of representation. Also significant is the size of the congregation. Most US congregations are very small. 85% consist of fewer than 250 people participating on a regular basis. 64% have fewer than 100. Again, contrast that with the parishes that you might be familiar with in the Catholic Church, and you will see that there is a disproportionate number of large membership parishes in a Catholic tradition. And when we look at budget size, It's also significant to note that most congregations have relatively small budgets, with $500,000 or less in total income, 78% in that category. I share this because I think it is important to see that there is this kind of diverse experience of people of faith and of religious institutions, parishes or congregations across the landscape, even prior to the intervention of the pandemic today. It also means that there are a large number of congregations, religious organizations, that are vulnerable because of their small size relative to the strength that comes from being much larger, much more robust. Now, during the pandemic, we also continued to collect data. And I want to share with you a little bit of what we had learned. This is research that we fielded last fall about the impact of COVID-19 on congregations. And this is a more qualitative analysis, really interested in the kind of response that we were seeing from religious communities about the impact of the pandemic on their congregation. Our driving question, how have congregations managed their resources in the midst of the pandemic? We really wanted to know the things that were pressing on leaders and the responses that were emerging from religious organizations. Thinking about the future, budget planning, financial adjustments, and reopening for in-person services were relevant. What we saw was that during the pandemic, more congregations reported an increase in participation than reported a decrease. And this is something totally fascinating about the engagement with online worship services and online engagement of spirituality. I don't think that any of us expected to see this, but we found that there was an accessibility about moving the life of a community to virtual engagement or remote engagement using technology that resulted in something fairly remarkable. Now, there's still a large proportion of these congregations that reported a decrease in engagement. We also see that more congregations experienced a decline in giving during this period than experienced an increase. Although when we look at a baseline of staying the same and having increased giving, we saw that that was the position of 60% of congregations that we had surveyed. When we look at giving changes by specific religious tradition, here is something that I think probably is unsurprising to you, but is distinctive for Catholic parishes, which is that giving declines were experienced much more widely and proved to be more durable among Roman Catholics than among mainline or evangelical Protestants by a significant factor. Now, I also believe that Catholic parishes resumed in-person Mass overall sooner than particularly mainline Protestant congregations did, and sooner than the average overall, but of course there's great variability there as well. The most interesting thing that I want to share with you from this kind of mid-pandemic research that we engaged in were around financial actions that were taken during the pandemic, and the percentage of congregations in our sample who reported these different kinds of activities. Plurality, 66%, had applied for payroll protection program in order to be able to maintain their staffing levels. Then the next most significant intervention financially was to reduce administrative expenses not related to personnel. And then this is where my heart sings, because the third most common response related to financial actions was around providing financial support or partnership to other congregations or nonprofits in need. And I have to say that my engagement with congregations of women religious over this time period reflects just that altruistic, outward focused kind of engagement, because I would say of the congregations that we have worked with, we saw again and again creative, generous responses to the needs of not only individuals, but also other organizations living out mission and ministry through their intervention in the community, and the way in which congregations of women religious could come alongside or support. This also expands into thinking about a special fund to support financial needs, either for individual members or for members of the community. And then some other means of reducing costs or thinking about changes. Now, we have just been, I wish that I had ready for you the finalized data, because we've just been in the field to ask some of these things. And I will just say that top line finding a year later, or well, it's not quite a year later, it's 6 months later, is to say that today, increasingly congregations are focused on that outward facing, community developing, future orientation, and much less anxious about how to preserve some of the operations of the organization. The distinctiveness of religious fundraising is that even when we have a reality like this one, not anticipating increasing our budget, there remains a powerful, faithful approach to supporting impact in the community, to advancing the mission above all else. And that is truly an advantage for communicators and development officers in thinking about the way in which a congregation and organization lives out its mission in the world. The people who support congregations of women religious, who are deeply committed to the mission of your affiliated sponsored ministries or the work of the congregation's charism, they have a motivation that is distinct from the motivation of donors to sort of your run-of-the-mill educational, human service, arts, nonprofit organization. And that is tied to meaning. It's tied to the meaning that you embody. When we think about the plans then being made for the future, we know that there is a need to address some of the technical, practical development pieces. Thinking about increasing or developing new fundraising appeals, continuing to be good stewards and reducing non-personnel expenses, thinking about the appropriate use of reserves or endowment. But again, when we have just updated this survey, increasingly we see that there is an emphasis on innovation and applying new things, as opposed to simply cutting in order to have cost savings. I will stop my slides here. I will just encourage you, we're going to move in just a moment to taking some questions, but I want to encourage you to connect with Lake Institute. We provide a wide range of resources. The article that Brian shared in the chat and that Ginny and I began this conversation around is part of our Insights newsletter, which is published twice monthly and is a great way for you to connect. And so I'll make sure that you have the link to subscribe to that as well. But follow us on Twitter or on Facebook. Please don't hesitate to reach out. I'm always very glad to talk with anyone. But the last thing that I will say before we transition to a time of some questions or discussion is simply that being in a season, and what is now really a very extended season of disruption, of external intervention on our best laid plans, has great potential for creative, engaged, authentic mission advancement. And that can feel like a bit of a reversal, because we recognize how much suffering there has been. We recognize how difficult these circumstances have been. But when there is clarity of the values, the mission, the vision of the work that we do, and if I know one thing about Women Religious, it's that there is clarity about who you are and what you represent in the world. That clarity is a tremendous signal to others, those who relate to you, whether they're donors or friends or beneficiaries of your ministries. There is just a wonderful opportunity to engage in meaning making for the future, and to draw together with imagination for what it means to be people of faith, representatives of the charism, ambassadors of the body of Christ, in the context of real uncertainty. Or a colleague said to me recently, a sense of liminality, because we are not going back to the way that things were. And there is not a new normal that has necessarily emerged, but instead we're in the midst of making a way, making a future through real transition. And I know for myself, it is a deep joy and a great encouragement to be able to have that take place alongside the tremendous witness of Women Religious, and those of us who are privileged enough to learn with and from congregations in their ministries, in their charism. So I've shared a great deal of detail about the context of this sort of familiar challenge in new circumstances, but I really look forward to hearing your questions. I see there are some in the chat, and I understand that Jennifer and Brian will help us to talk through some of those.
Thank you so much, Melissa. That is a very comprehensive presentation. I do see that Ginny has asked, are there concerns about cutting through the clutter, especially since there are more nonprofit organizations, and decreasing engagement with religions?
So, I mean, yes, I would say yes. I think that today, for religious, both women and men, the recognition that the donor base that has been known and trusted and cultivated is diminishing, aging, in much the same way that the population of religious is aging, means that there is a need to build new relationships and communicate more effectively about the ministry, mission, and charism, so that those who did not have sisters as Catholic school teachers, or who weren't cared for by nurses who were sisters in their local hospital system, can have an experience of their own related to the impact of religious in their lives. I also think that the declining religious affiliation, and that's true of both what we think of as sort of a nominal Catholics, or thinking also about people who are truly disaffiliated. We misunderstand that disaffiliation if we think that they are not motivated by the same things that more traditional religious members or donors would have been motivated by. The yearning to make meaning remains. I know that some of you might be familiar with the Nuns and Nuns Project, NUNS and NONES together. And I think that this is actually just such a poignant example of how eager younger people, yes, but not only younger people, people who are disconnected from faith community, how eager they are to make meaning, and how much of their yearning for community, for sense of purpose, can be satisfied by the example of religious with deep experience in that community living and meaning making. I just think that there is more and more opportunity, but it does require that we look beyond our inherited or traditional models of relating to constituent and instead open up a broader possibility about the way in which we might relate to a whole host of individuals who are looking for something that they don't know we have to offer. I think about a nun's life as an effective mechanism for that kind of communication. We also have had the privilege in our current cohort of advancing mission to work with the Daughters of St. Paul, the media nuns, and thinking about their transformation from running bookstores to having a very vibrant social media presence. There are just all kinds of possibilities for connection. We're all adept now at this kind of remote gathering in a way that I have to say, I would never have imagined 18 months ago. And it has its limitations, absolutely. I am so eager to be back in a room with people where we can have a different kind of conversation at table and at the bar afterwards. But there is something really, really beautiful about being able to use technology to facilitate relationship, to facilitate communication. So I think that's where I would land in response to that inquiry.
Yeah, I was very struck by your the data you shared about participation during the pandemic. And I wondered if you would talk a little bit about what communication channels you think have been the most effective between religious communities and their donors during the pandemic.
I think it's a wonderful question. What I saw, particularly working with congregations of women religious, was that the development of more robust social communication, so using Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, using YouTube to be able to invite people into the community, into the pattern of worship, or to share out some of the things that were happening, was incredibly vital. But there is also something really beautiful about more traditional or legacy forms of communication. Again and again, I had development directors, communication staff, and leadership say to me, particularly our older sisters, were so disconnected and looking for some way to be connected because of the prolonged shutdown. And so we had a letter writing, phone call, Zoom call campaign. And I mean, I think about development, but this is communication strategy of having one-to-one conversations and having them be truly pastoral in nature, just checking in, caring about the people entrusted to the organization, whether those are affiliates, oblates, or thinking about people who are donors, people who are committee members or volunteers or regular participants in retreat, making that effort to reach out and to say, how are you? What has your experience been like? How can we pray for you? It is a deepening activity that I know can feel very uncomfortable if it feels like it's instrumental to development. But what I know is that it is, in fact, the connective tissue that holds an extended community together. It's about relationship and finding ways to do that, even when we cannot be physically together, even when we can't have our annual event or share Mass in person with one another. There is just something really vital about making sure there's a strategy in place to build and maintain those relationships.
I see a follow-up question, actually a couple from Ginny. I'll just read this one. I've heard that younger donors don't want to just hand over a check, but want to get involved in the mission and the ministry. Is the research supporting this theory that younger donors want to be hands-on?
Absolutely. I mean, there's all kinds of research. I'll see if I can send some things that would be particularly pertinent there. What we see increasingly is twofold. There is a generational difference in the approach that Generation X and boomers and older take versus millennial and Generation Z. It does tend to break down on this level of wanting to be more intimately connected to impact for younger donors, as opposed to being invested in maintenance of the institution, perpetuation of the mission for its own sake. And also, generational transition is one dimension. The other dimension is really about culture change. That I would say broadly and increasingly, donors of all ages wish to be connected to making a difference, as opposed to maintaining an institution. So in the whole nonprofit sector, we talk about a transition away from institution-centered models of fundraising and toward a donor-centered model. And that can feel like a very disruptive shift, because it means that the appeal then is not about just help us to maintain being who we are matters. Instead, it is an appeal to the donor's sense of who they are and what it is that they wish to accomplish or achieve through their giving, and helping them to see how the alignment between their own vocation, and I love to talk about this in terms of vocation, not just a religious vocation, but the vocation of all people to participate in the body of Christ, to serve the church. What is it that donor is called to do, and how does it align with the mission of the organization, the mission of the congregation? And when there is that alignment, there can just be tremendous synergy. But I think of that as a culture change, because I see donors of all ages making that transition in the way that they think about their giving. And that is true when we think about giving during the lifetime. It's also true with planned giving or estate gift, that increasingly we see that donors who are planning for giving at the end of their lifetime want to be sure that they will have an impact with their gift, not just be perpetuating an institution, especially if the institution doesn't have clarity of vision or mission.
Thank you. We have just a few minutes left here together. I would like to thank you again, Melissa, for an outstanding presentation, for the time you've spent with us and the thought you put into preparing your presentation. We're all very grateful for that. I would like to wrap with a couple of announcements. The next webinar for the CWR Academy will be on July the 8th. It is about the Meet Our Sisters tour, and I'm looking forward to hearing that one myself. That's a hands-on kind of thing. I have missed events of all kind, especially that. I'd also like to mention that the CWR Awards program, where we recognize outstanding work and collaboration among CWR members, the deadline for submissions is June the 30th. You can check the CWR website for details about that. There will be a survey following this so that you can give your input on how this presentation affected you and what more you would like to see in the future. This webinar, of course, recorded, and you can see it in its entirety again if once wasn't enough, or if anyone missed it the first time, on the CWR website. Brian, may I ask you, do you have any other messages that I've missed?
Nope, I think you just about covered it. We do, of course, have registration ongoing for this year's conference in Memphis, but beside that.
All right, thank you. So I believe that I mentioned right at the top that we have a development resource group within CWR to serve people who are working in the area of advancing mission. I encourage you, if you want to know more about that and aren't already involved, to contact Ginny Heiser by email. She will help you with details about that. And other than that, I think that wraps us up. Thank you so much for being here, all of you, taking your time to absorb this information and to think about how we can help you as an organization. So until next time, I will wish you a fun and safe Canada Day on July the 1st and US Independence Day on July the 4th, and an enjoyable summer wherever you may be. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.